It didn't sound like a scandal. It didn't even sound like a fight. It sounded like a door closing. And that's what made it unsettling. This is a new, idle, even better way, because when people think of tragic news in royal terms, they expect fireworks, a dramatic quote, a bitter leak, a tabloid headline with too many exclamation points. But this was the opposite. Cold, measured, almost administrative. A few words that, if you weren't listening closely, you could mistake for nothing. No official path forward. Let that sit for a second. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Not we're working on it. Not time will tell. Not private conversations are ongoing. Just, there is no institutional role envisioned for Meghan going forward. And I'm choosing those words carefully, because the point here isn't to sensationalize what was said. The point is to recognize what that kind of sentence does. It doesn't attack, it doesn't blame, it doesn't even argue, it ends the conversation. And I know what some of you are thinking right now. Haven't we basically known that for years? Haven't the lines already been drawn? Maybe. But this is different, because the difference isn't in the outcome. The difference is in the confirmation, in who is saying it, and how they're saying it. There's a reason institutions rarely speak in absolutes. Ambiguity is a pressure valve. It keeps options alive. It protects reputations. It leaves room for a future pivot if the world changes, or the strategy changes, or the public mood shifts. Royal communications, especially, are built on that. You get phrases like, in due course, ongoing discussions, the family remains united, all those soft edges that let everyone save face. So when you get a sentence that basically says, there is no route back into official life, you're not hearing emotion, you're hearing policy, and policy is harder to undo than anger. Here's why this matters right now, not historically. A lot of stories about royals get trapped in the past, old feuds, old interviews, old footage replayed until it loses all meaning. But a statement like this doesn't belong to the archive. It belongs to the future. It changes expectations going forward. It narrows what's possible from this moment on. And I want you to consider something that's easy to miss. This wasn't framed as punishment. It wasn't framed as revenge. It was framed as inevitability, as if the institution had simply done the math. Is that worse? I'm not sure. It's certainly colder. Now, I'm not going to pretend we have every detail neatly tied up here, because we don't. There are still questions, quiet ones, that hang behind that phrasing. Why now? Why make it explicit now, instead of letting the ambiguity float like it always has? And more importantly, what happened behind the scenes that made ambiguity feel too risky? Because people don't close doors they still want to use. And the most important part of that message wasn't even what it said out loud. Accepting that cup of coals along the boat, couple, compay, it was what it made impossible. Because once you start listening to the wording instead of the noise around it, you realize something uncomfortable. Royal statements are designed to leave doors open. That's not speculation. That's function. They're written to be flexible, to survive leadership changes, public mood swings, even personal reconciliation behind closed doors. The language bends on purpose. It avoids final verbs. It prefers phrases that can be reinterpreted later, if needed. This one didn't bend. No official path forward. That sentence doesn't wander. It doesn't hedge. It doesn't gesture toward a future that might look different if the right apology is made or the right moment arrives. It doesn't even suggest that the future is undecided. It tells you, very calmly, that the future has already been decided. And it doesn't include an institutional role for Meghan. That's the sentence that ended the conversation. Not publicly, maybe, not emotionally, but structurally. And here's the part that's easy to underestimate. This wasn't a dramatic rejection. It was something far more definitive. It was a classification. In institutional language, when something is described as not envisioned, it means it's not being planned for, budgeted for, or structurally accommodated. You don't build scaffolding around possibilities you don't intend to allow. So this wasn't about optics. It wasn't about headlines. It was about removing the need to keep a space open. Ask yourself this. When was the last time a royal statement so clearly removed ambiguity without offering an alternative? No private life. No independent path. No soft landing language to cushion the implication. Just absence. That absence is doing a lot of work. because ambiguity, for all its frustration, is merciful. It lets people imagine reconciliation even when none is happening. It lets supporters believe there is a pause, not an ending. It lets critics argue that nothing has been finalized. Once ambiguity is gone, imagination has nowhere to hide, and that's where the emotional shift happens. This isn't about whether you support Meghan or criticize her. This isn't about sides. It's about what it feels like when an institution stops imagining you into its future. Not condemning you, not erasing your past, just no longer planning for your presence. That's a different kind of finality. Now, some will argue that this is simply stating the obvious, that the role ended years ago. But if that were truly the case, this sentence wouldn't have been necessary. Institutions don't clarify what everyone already understands unless the misunderstanding has become costly, unless someone, somewhere, still believed there was leverage left. So who was this clarification really for? The public? Possibly. The press? But maybe. Or someone closer to the situation who needed to hear, in unmistakable terms, that the door wasn't just closed, it had been taken off the blueprint. And that brings us to the part that changes the entire weight of this statement, because it didn't come from just anyone, and it couldn't have. What matters next isn't the sentence itself, it's who was finally willing to say it out loud. And once you understand that, the silence around it starts to make a lot more sense. This statement could not have come from the king, and that's not a coincidence. If you followed royal communication for any length of time, you know there's an unspoken rule about who delivers which kinds of messages. Kings absorb, IBN. They delay, they soften. The dark settle, especially when the subject is family, especially when the consequences ripple outward. A reigning monarch, by design, carries the past with him. His words are weighed down by continuity, by memory, by obligation to keep threads uncut even when they're fraying. That's why this didn't come from him, it came from Prince William, the man who represents not the institution as it was, but the institution as it intends to be. It still is not always based, and that shift matters more than people realize. William's role isn't just ceremonial succession. He is the bridge between legacy and architecture, between what the monarchy has tolerated before and what it's willing to structurally carry forward. When he speaks, especially in language this restrained, it's less about emotion and more about design, about what will exist and what will not. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a brother speaking from hurt. It wasn't a son defending his father. It wasn't even a personal boundary being drawn. It was an institutional line delivered by someone who will inherit the consequences of leaving it blurred. And that's where the tension quietly spikes. Because when William confirms that there is no official path forward, he's not just describing the present, he's signaling what will not be revisited when leadership fully transitions. He's saying this isn't unfinished business waiting for a different reign. This isn't a problem to be relitigated later. It's settled. There's a reason that felt so heavy. Even without dramatic language. We're used to conflict being loud, raised voices, leaks, retaliation. This had none of that, which forces a harder question onto the table. What happens when something is decided not in anger, but in acceptance? Ask yourself honestly, which is harder to undo? Anger cools. Acceptance doesn't. And here's another detail worth sitting with. William didn't frame this as a response to Meghan. He framed it as a statement about the institution's future. That's a subtle but powerful repositioning. It removes the conversation from personal conduct and places it into structural necessity. In other words, it's no longer about what someone did or didn't do. It's about what the system can no longer carry. That's not a judgment. It's a calculation, and calculations don't apologize. So when people ask why this moment feels different, why it landed with a strange finality even without spectacle, this is why. The voice mattered, the timing mattered, and the absence of emotion mattered most of all. Because once the future speaks, the past loses its leverage. And the moment William said this out loud, something else quietly vanished, something that had kept this story alive far longer than anyone wants to admit. We're going to talk about that next, and once you see what disappeared, you'll understand why this wasn't just an announcement, it was a lock clicking into place. What disappeared wasn't a title, it wasn't a meeting, it wasn't even a hypothetical invitation. What disappeared was possibility. And that's harder to see, because it doesn't make noise when it leaves. When people talk about exclusion, they imagine something active, a door slammed, a name removed, a punishment handed down. But this wasn't exclusion. This was something quieter and, in many ways, more permanent. It was the decision to stop imagining a role at all. To stop designing around the idea that reintegration might one day be necessary. That's what no role envisioned actually means. In institutional terms, envisioning is the first step of existence. You don't build structures for things you don't envision. You don't leave placeholders for people you don't plan to accommodate. You don't keep drafts open if the chapter isn't going to be written. So this wasn't about taking something away, and it was about deciding not to plan for it ever returning. And that distinction matters, because it explains the strange emotional flatness of the moment. There was no outrage, no rebuttal, no immediate counter-narrative, just stillness, a kind of informational vacuum where speculation used to live. Ask yourself, when was the last time a royal controversy ended without a follow-up, without a softening statement or a sources say walk back? That silence isn't accidental. It's what happens when there's nothing left to negotiate. Ambiguity is oxygen for ongoing drama. It keeps stories alive. It lets both sides believe the future could tilt in their favor. Once ambiguity is gone, drama suffocates. There's nothing left to argue against, because the argument itself has been rendered irrelevant. That's why this feels different from previous moments that were louder, messier, more emotional. Those moments still carried the possibility of movement. This one doesn't. It's static by design. And here's where the irony sets in. For years, people argued over whether the monarchy was being too harsh or too lenient, too rigid or too accommodating. But this decision doesn't sit neatly in either category. It's not punitive, it's not forgiving, it's administrative, almost bored in its certainty, which raises an uncomfortable question. What does it say when an institution no longer reacts at all? Because reaction implies engagement. Silence implies resolution. Now, to be clear, this doesn't erase the past. It doesn't rewrite history or undo public chapters that have already been lived, but it does something subtler. It reframes them as complete, as closed systems, not ongoing narratives. And once a narrative is closed, it stops generating new meaning. That's the part people haven't fully absorbed yet. The door didn't slam, it locked. And locks aren't designed for drama. They're designed for permanence. But here's the part that hasn't been discussed enough, and it's the part that should make you pause. Because if there truly is no path forward, if the institution has stopped envisioning any role at all, then what, exactly, comes next for the story itself? What fills the space after nothing? That's where this gets uncomfortable, and that's what we need to talk about next. Endings aren't always loud. Don't categorize optimism. Sometimes they arrive as a blank space where something used to be expected. And that's the part that's hardest to sit with here. When an institution says there is no path forward, it doesn't replace that path with another one. It doesn't redirect. It doesn't suggest a parallel route. It simply removes the idea that movement in that direction is relevant anymore. The story doesn't continue. It doesn't escalate. What the board knows, it just stops being carried. That's why this moment feels heavier than many of the dramatic episodes that came before it. Those moments were fueled by conflict. Conflict creates energy. It invites response, rebuttal, escalation. This doesn't, but this absorbs energy. It drains it. It leaves behind a strange quiet where people keep waiting for the next shoe to drop and slowly realize there may not be one. Think back to the opening question. What if the most devastating royal news doesn't sound dramatic at all? This is what that looks like. No accusations, no emotional language, no visible triumph on either side. Just a clear signal that the institution has moved on from the need to keep imagining a reconciliation scenario. Not because of anger, not because of fear, but because, at some point, continuation became inefficient. That's an unsettling word in a family story. Efficient. But this wasn't framed as a family moment, it was framed as a structural reality. And that framing changes how we should understand everything that follows, or doesn't follow. Because once something is categorized as structurally unnecessary, it's no longer debated internally. It's no longer revisited with each news cycle. It becomes background, fixed, boring even. and boredom is the true end of relevance. There's a temptation to read this as cruelty or coldness, but that misses the deeper implication. This wasn't about inflicting pain, it was about removing uncertainty. For the institution, uncertainty is risk. Risk invites instability. And instability is the one thing monarchies are designed to eliminate, not dramatize. So where does that leave the public narrative? In an uncomfortable place, because stories thrive on tension, and this decision dissolves tension rather than feeding it. It tells us there will be no dramatic return arc, no negotiated middle ground, no surprise pivot quietly waiting for the right season, just a completed chapter that will now be referenced only in the past tense. And that forces a final question onto the audience, onto all of us. If there truly is no path forward, they're real and difficult duties. What happens to the meaning people projected onto the possibility of one? Do those hopes fade quietly, positive? Do they harden into resentment, or do they simply drift away, unnoticed, the way expectations often do when they're no longer acknowledged? I don't think this story is over because everything has been explained. I think it feels over because nothing else is being prepared. And that's a very different kind of ending. If you're still thinking about what those words really mean, you're not alone. Let me know how you interpreted that phrasing in the comments. Subscribe if you want to keep following these moments where silence speaks louder than spectacle. And share this if you think others might have missed what was actually said here, because sometimes the most tragic news isn't delivered with outrage. It's delivered with finality.